Welcome to the fourth section of Ethics in Education for EDN 3200. In today's section, we're going to look at whether codes or rules can ever truly capture what it means to be ethical. It's the last of the heavy lifting sections, but the Biesta paper is tricky, and I'm sure it's made your brains do some loop-de-loops. So let's step through it slowly together. In this section, we're going to explore the relation between ethics and rules. We're going to step through Biesta's argument, move by move. In step 1, he says that we've seen a change in how people, groups, institutions, and government relate to each other in the last 40 years. His next move is that we should notice this change has happened in education too, and a lot has been written about it, particularly in England. But we will also see that these relations, although not exactly the same as the English case, have played out in South Africa as well. The next move, he says, we can describe this change and summarize it as a narrowing of the idea of responsibility to a shadow, poorer version of itself, known as accountability. Biesta says this has caused problems in how people relate to each other ethically. In particular, it has reduced a political relation to an economic one. But, he says, after that, it's hard to say you're against accountability because it sounds like you're arguing for irresponsibility. So critiquing accountability requires a difference between what we mean by responsibility and accountability. And we want to do this so that we can reclaim the idea of responsibility again. Biesta's next move then is to say, well, how could we tell the difference? And he uses the work of Zygmunt Bauman, who distinguishes between what he calls ethics, that is codes and laws, instructions and rules, versus morals, what is actually right and wrong. Now, there's some fancy footwork here using strange words like proximity, unbridged distance, and how the state of moral attention can only be held between two people, in Bauman's view. We'll unpack that a little bit more later. And Bauman also then goes on to say that when we've got more than two people, we end up with a tricky issue because as soon as we hit into groups, we tend to fold back into codes again, what he calls socialization, or into raw emotive power of the mob, what he calls sociality. In both these states, we are not autonomous agents, Bauman says, pondering and trying to figure out what is the right thing to do for ourselves. We end up subverting our own morality back to that of the group. The change Biesta identified in his first move, he rates as more down to socialization, codes, control, and conformity, which Bauman sees as a really fundamental shortcoming of the modern era. It's interesting that these often relate to monism, the idea that there is only one way of thinking about what is right, which we examined in the last section. But Biesta says this shift is not irreversible. Doing good and right then, he argues, must rely on some kind of a conscience and not on following rules, even if that conscience is fragile and weak. Setting up the framework in this way allows us to see the difference between accountability, which is codes and socialization, versus responsibility, which is moral conscience. And it also illustrates why it is really hard for responsibility to gain the upper hand in a culture of accountability. But while this hope is tenuous, argues Biesta, it is probably our best shot for restoring genuine responsibility in education against the tyranny of the rulebook. So Biesta begins by drawing our attention to how relations between the state, schools, teachers and parents have shifted over the last 40 years. He attributes this to what he calls a culture of accountability, which reduces political relations, that is, collective decision-making and reciprocity, to economic relations, that of the customer or client or provider of consumer type relations, with education as some kind of a commodity. Biesta traces the origins of the term accountability back to financing, literally doing the accounts, and notices the shift from accounting for money to literally accounting for everything. He argues that the idea of moving the logic from financing to everything is weak, since, as he quoted Charlton, only insofar as it is legitimate to assume that the provision of auditable documentation is synonymous with responsible behavior. That is, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. Have a look at the McNamara fallacy for another take on this. For example, time spent evaluating a child's work is uncountable, and hence its benefits are often bypassed or ignored in calculating a teacher's workload, or what she's done. For another example, the way that a student's development is literally reduced to their grades, and everything else falls away. It is never counted, in another example, as an achievement for a school to say that they have supported the children who are vulnerable in their community who otherwise would have dropped out, because it's not something that could be measured or easily observed. In the world of accountability, it's key performance indicators that matter. And, unfortunately, this emphasis means that these indicators get schools and teachers' attention to the detriment of other important tasks and activities, most notably care work. Accountability also often fails on its own terms. As Biesta mentions, the focus shifts from the aim and purpose to procedural compliance. We'll look at this with some examples later. Although Biesta mostly cites the English case in this paper, there is ample research elsewhere that traces much of these shifts and issues in other countries, including South Africa. Unfortunately, as a former English colony, South Africa has a habit of mirroring much English policy. For example, England had what they called SATs, which were end of key stage assessment tests at the end of grades 3, 6 and 9. Not long after, South Africa introduced ANAs, Annual National Assessments, in, you guessed it, grades 3, 6 and 9. England centralised its curriculum in 1989, and South Africa has had a centralised curriculum since the late 50s or early 60s, as this was a mechanism of apartheid control. You may remember this from Kate Angier's lectures. England has school inspectors, referred to as Ofsted. The Western Cape Education Department wants to reintroduce school inspectors, who were originally scrapped in the mid-90s, since the role of inspectors during apartheid was abominable in schools, especially schools for black students. England also introduced charter schools, they called them academies, which are basically public schools run by private outfits. South Africa is playing with collaboration schools, which are also charters. This model is supposed to make managing schools more efficient. Can you spot the new managerialist tone in that aim? There are some important differences, even though much of what Biesta mentions in this paper does transfer quite well to the South African context. One of these differences is the English league table system, where schools are compared each year in a competition as to who is the best. Although we do something similar with our matric results in a less obvious way here. Schools in South Africa are still in competition with each other, but at a more local scale. You'll find that, for example, the high schools in Khayelitsha will compete with each other to attract the supposedly easiest to teach students, but they certainly won't see themselves as in competition with the likes of a Westerford or a Wynberg Boys or Girls High. However, those former Model C schools will also see each other as rivals. The The second notable difference is that Biesta attributes middle-class anxiety to some of the drive towards narrow audit culture accountability in England. And in South Africa, we have a much smaller middle class compared to England, and hence this middle class desire to keep up with the super rich is not so much of a driving factor here. What is happening here is an anxious government who wants to improve quality through increasing accountability while keeping costs down. That is, new managerial approaches are about squeezing more out of schools without having to consider whether they are adequately financed to do their work. Just a random note aside, the way that schools are named in the UK is just weird. I mean, what they call a public school is actually a private school. What they call a grammar school is kind of like our former Model C schools, although instead of fee charging, they administer entrance exams. And what they call a comprehensive is the equivalent of our normal fee-free school here, although theirs are much better resourced. What Biesta is saying is that public schools more and more want to be like private schools that run as a business and pick up the logic, terms, and ideals from the private sector and import them into the public sector, with a lot of help from neoliberal policymakers. You probably covered some of this with Yunus Omar earlier in the year. But this reduction of relations between city and state, families and schools, schools and the state, from a political relationship to an economic one, is critical if we are to understand the shifts that have happened. The choices in markets made by customers are not the same as democratic decisions made by full public deliberation. In particular, the idea of the collective or common good gets lost, since each individual is for him or herself. Questions of, say, how to distribute public resources more justly at the system level to where it is most needed. That kind of question becomes difficult to ask under marketized conditions. And this is becoming far more obvious to the general public in the debate about school reopening during the pandemic. Another hallmark of the accountability regime is a focus on quality and quality assurance, which Biesta notes have become almost empty of meaning. These terms are so overused. He states, quality assurance is about efficiency and effectiveness of the process itself, not about what the process is supposed to bring about, without addressing the far more difficult normative and political question regarding what such processes ought to bring about. You can notice here the ethical framing from Biesta when he uses words like normative and ought. What does Biesta mean by this? Well, here's a South African example that you will encounter, and no doubt you will get the mudding with it when you start to work as a teacher. The Integrated Quality Management System, or IQMS. IQMS sounds good on the surface. Every year, a teacher selects one peer and one senior to form an evaluation team so that she can be evaluated as to how she's performing as a teacher. The teacher must then deliver an evaluation lesson with her team present to watch and grade her against a set list of criteria, scoring 1, which is pretty terrible, up to 4, which is pretty great, on each criterion. She too rates her own performance on the same criteria. The three of them that get together compare notes, compare scores, haggle and deliberate over differences in the scores, and come to an agreement. The final collated score is then tallied up and becomes her final IQMS score, which is submitted to the provincial department. Consistently high IQMS scores means she'll probably get a higher pay notch increase. Consistently low IQMS scores means she will get a lower pay notch increase. But it does not affect her job security, so she can allegedly feel safe to evaluate herself and others more openly. Now, this sounds all right, right? Unfortunately, it is replete with issues. As you can see, the process is the focus. It only becomes a meaningful exercise if A, everybody involved takes it seriously, and B, can afford to undergo this IQMS for developmental purposes rather than for other purposes. Now, if a teacher is concerned that she's unable to demonstrate excellence for some reason, well, perhaps she's forced to teach outside her subject specialism because the tight school staffing mean that there's insufficient flexibility to keep staff in their subject areas. Well, then this IQMS process will not necessarily professionally capacitate her to do a better job. There's also nothing in the IQMS process that is about specific curriculum content or pedagogical content knowledge, or about longitudinal support and mentorship, or continued professional pedagogic development. Additionally, the teacher may not want to invite colleagues to be on her evaluation team who she perceives to be hostile or likely to score her low, even if they may be the most appropriate people to evaluate her practice professionally. She would probably prefer to choose collegial colleagues who will be lenient and enable her to get a higher score. But why wouldn't she? It's not a great idea to put one's future pay rise in the hands of someone you feel dislikes you, and it's certainly an awful feeling to give a crit lesson in front of people who you feel are judging you harshly. There are two additional factors that might conflate and create extra context. In exposed schools, there are very few spare teachers in any one given lesson slot. The teacher provisioning from the state is the bare minimum. There's a reason why fee-collecting schools hire loads of extra staff. And so, when IQMS season rolls around, doing the crit lessons becomes incredibly time-consuming, and it pulls teachers out of their own lessons to go and watch each other's evaluations. Everyone in the school has to do this, remember, so one member of staff might find herself involved in 3 or 4 IQMS processes at any one time. During IQMS season, lessons are constantly disrupted by the process because teachers have too few free periods to watch each other teach. And beyond the problem with IQMS, you can see why that is a problem in general for teacher collaboration. The other factor is that pressure from teachers from poorer communities who are feeling the need to maximize income if they can because they are the sole breadwinner of a large extended family who depends on them. If finessing your IQMS a bit means you can buy your sister's children much needed new shoes or look after your sick mom, well, then you would do it. I know I would. So what does this IQMS example indicate? That the focus is on procedure, not purpose. It is meant to, quote, hold teachers accountable and, quote, ensure quality. But in fact, what it does is burden already meagre school resources and is flagrantly unfit for its purpose. Do the scores from the IQMS process actually reflect teachers' abilities and quality? Not really. It's just ticking boxes for ticking boxes' sake. And it produces all sorts of other distortions. As Biesta states on page 240, the impact of this phenomenon on the day-to-day practice in schools and other institutions is that institutions adapt themselves to the requirements of accountability and audit rather than the other way round. And it elicits behavior that suits inspectors and those responsible for quality assurance rather than to encourage professional and responsible action. I want to share with you another example of exactly this phenomenon when I was starting my teaching career in England and I got caught in the thick of this issue. One of the ways that league tables rate schools' performance is on how many school exit examination candidates score 60% on or more on English and maths. This twisted and distorted schools to do all sorts of weird and wonderful things, even when it's not in the interests of the learners. When I was training, the head of the maths department at the school I worked for would rope me into her latest scheme to boost the school's maths marks. The scheme looked something like this. Every student who was borderline, that is scoring somewhere between 50 and 60%, was deregistered from the official maths exam and registered to sit an alternative online exam meant for adult education. Completing this online exam successfully was considered the equivalent of 60% on the normal exam, and it counted as such towards the school's final result. Except the online exam was multiple choice, and you could sit it as many times as you liked until you got the score you wanted. So you can imagine what happened here. I had to take the 20 or so students identified as at risk, extract them from other classes, their history class, their geography class, their French class, and supervise them to sit this online maths exam again and again and again until they got the mark that the school wanted. The school justified this behavior to itself by arguing that getting the improved maths mark increased the students' prospects too when they went on to university or college. But the truth is, it was about the school's ratings. That the students missed their classes and other teachers had to have their students taken away from them didn't seem to bother the school at all. Never mind the dishonesty involved in the process. So while the English example is a clear, blatant distortion, the IQMS example gives us another illustration of what Biesta states in his paper, namely that it is difficult to say one is against accountability because it sounds like you're advocating that people should be allowed to be irresponsible. Critiquing the IQMS system is often interpreted in this way. Are you saying teachers shouldn't be evaluated? They might ask. Biesta argues that to critique accountability without advocating irresponsibility, we need to be clear on the difference between accountability and responsibility. We want to reclaim this idea of responsibility again. Biesta uses the somewhat challenging work of Zygmunt Bauman to try and make this distinction. Now, before we go on to Bauman's work, I just want to highlight an inconsistency between the way that he uses the words ethics and morality and the way that I have in these lectures. I use them as interchangeable, since this is the most common everyday way of using and understanding them. However, Bauman is trying to give different labels to illustrate differences he wants to foreground, and so he uses the term ethics to refer to codes, rules, and representations of what ought to be, and he refers to morals to refer to doing the right thing in all its ambiguity and uncertainty. If I tried to stick to Bauman's labeling, I would have had to retitle the whole lecture module and every piece of text describing it. Also, other authors, such as Christie, have used the word ethics where Bauman uses the word morals. So, I will continue to use the word ethics and morals interchangeably as I have done before. But I will be very explicit and refer to ethical rules and codes to refer to Bauman's ethics, and I will refer to contemplating and doing the right thing in the moment to refer to Bauman's morality. I hope that's clearer, and the stitching of meaning of words that we've already used before is contiguous through the lectures now. Okay, so if Bauman's work is a little cryptic to you, please don't stress. It's really not the easiest of stuff. Especially those of you who are operating in English as an additional language, I promise you, it's not your English. This is tricky. So let's try and tease this out and make it clear. Bauman basically identifies a moment of uncertainty, which he terms as waiting or giving attention, and it requires what he calls a moral proximity. What's going on here? Basically, Bauman reckons that the moment of morality, of doing the right thing, in the moment is a decision that is always unclear. In this moment, you suspend yourself, your needs, wants, and desires, and you really try to tune in to what is required by the other person who presents the moral decision you have to make. I like to think of a thought experiment with this. Imagine again you lived on a desert island with no one else except one other person. Just you and that other person. There's no social consensus. There's no rule of law. There's no Bible to tell you what you should and shouldn't do. There's just this other person. And one day, this other person asks for your help. It's not a small ask. It'll be difficult and involve significant cost for you. You are now in proximity. You cannot ignore the other person as someone to whom your care does not apply. That is what Bauman would say, you can't distance yourself. You know this person could never give back to you for the assistance that they ask, so expecting reciprocity is not the point of the exercise. You can't reduce this person to a set of traits or characteristics that will help resolve your dilemma. For example, well, he's poor, so I must help. And nor can you pretend that he is subhuman and hence not deserving of your consideration. For example, he's a foreigner, so he's not my problem. It is in this moment of not knowing what the right thing is to do that Bauman is getting at as the substance of morality and ethics. We are, he says, waiting, proximate and paying attention to see how things unfold in and of themselves, rather than using an externally calibrated compass of laws or codes to guide us. But as soon as there are more than two people in the situation, Bauman argues, this bubble of moral proximity bursts. We turn to the third person to consult. We seek affirmation on our choice. In short, we seek a code or guide on what is the right thing to do. Bauman says, the condition of not being haunted by scruples is quite easy to obtain, to be sure. In fact, we all obtain it, and we are in it most of the time. But that most of the time, we move outside the realm of moral action into the area where conventions and etiquette, going through codified and thus easily learnable and readable notions, as well as the simple rule of respect for the other's privacy, will do. And the rest of the time, though, we are in morally charged situations, and that means being on our own. This ethical demand of a morally charged situation, using Logstrup's term, is a lonely place. Perhaps the most easily relatable pop culture reference is the idea of it's lonely at the top, i.e. that moment in a dramatic movie when a leader is confronted with a dilemma which affects her team, clan, tribe, or group, and no one can tell her what the right thing is to do. She must make a choice, and she alone must live with consequences. Calculations won't save her. This is the morality that Bauman means. It is, he says, quote, endemically and irredeemably non-rational in the sense of not being calculable. In fact, many stories about maverick leaders and ethical dilemmas illustrate Bauman's point well. They are often breaking the rules to do what they think is right, even if this means they will suffer negative consequences. But, in the end, it is clear that following the rules, however scrupulously, can never save us from responsibility, says Biesta. What Bauman has done is he has turned the popular myth of modern monistic thinking on its head. He is saying that confusion doesn't arise from stupidity, ignorance, or weakness. Confusion arises because we appreciate the full complex contradictory richness of a normative issue at hand, and we do not reduce it to a set of rules or codes. There are two ways in which doing the right thing collapses back into social consensus or conformity with a group's ideals, rather than deploying our own thinking and feeling minds to evaluate what is right and good. The first is what Bauman calls socialization, where we folded into social consensus through structures, domestication, and subordination through control. These structures might not necessarily promote outright immoral behavior, but they can't be assumed to promote good behavior either. It is that difference that illustrates that there is a gap between what is legal and what is ethical. The second is sociality, which, in Bauman's word, for the visceral emotiveness of the crowd, the intoxication of the mob, effectively. In neither case is the individual actually standing up for what she has contemplated to be right or good. She's going along with the group's impulse, either codified in the case of socialization or impulsive in the case of sociality. I recommend Elias Canetti's Crowds and Power for an interesting discussion of this. And this has some interesting implications for what we discussed in section 1 about social consensus as a source of moral ethics. If social consensus is just falling in with the group and not thinking for ourselves, can it ever be a reliable form of ethics? Bauman says, neither socialization of society nor sociality of the crowd tolerate moral independence. Both explore and obtain obedience, though one by design and the other by default. Neither reason nor passion seething in the togetherness of the crowd can help the self to be moral. They only help the self to survive in the wide, strange world that has no home for morality. So what does this all mean for accountability and responsibility? Well, we set out at the beginning to say that if we wished to critique a narrow ordered culture, accountability that has emptied school practices and relations of rich professional meaning, well, then we need to be able to distinguish between this narrow accountability and the preferred responsibility that should be restored in its place, without being accused of wanting to discard any sort of responsibility at all. Bauman's distinctions do this for us. Accountability is following the code. Responsibility is doing the right thing. He also shows us how easy it is to fold in again to the group's expectations, whether from the rulebook or the mob. And Biesta's not naive about this. He recognizes that the potential to exercise responsibility is small and severely limited by circumstances. And that is including the fact that people find it easier to just go with the flow. However, what he calls a moral conscience is not totally lost. It's only anesthetized, he says, not amputated. Conscience is, he says, to be sure, extremely weak. It can neither convince nor coerce. But, given this, it may strike the modern mind as preposterous to suggest that conscience seems to be the only means we have for exposing, without any guarantee of success, the immorality of both codified morality and the norms of the majority. Bauman notices that while it is a small hope, it may be our only one, and it is a hope nonetheless. Okay, so, in the words of the director Spike Lee, doing the right thing is hardly easy, especially when no one can tell you what the right thing is. Biesta, however, foregrounds some very serious consequences of not doing the right thing, of this narrowing of responsibility, challenging as it is, to accountability, that is, codified morals for teachers. Not least among these is the fact that accountability deprofessionalizes teachers. We'll look at this with Prof. Badruddin in the next block. If teachers are told by some ethical algorithm or accountability checklist what they should do, they are stripped of their decision-making autonomy. This is quite ironic. In following the accountability rulebook, they actually become unaccountable in the true sense. Think back to the example I gave of the school in England. That school was doing something morally wrong. There is no way of calling them out on it because they had, in technicist terms, followed the rules. And this concomitant client-service provider type of relationship that comes with economizing relationships under the ordered culture also gives parents and students a false sense of customer power, which is not real power. Furthermore, teachers and schools are stranded on the wrong side of the fence in both their relation to students and parents and in their relation to the state. They become trapped on the provider side of the equation, Biesta says, all the while having lost control over what it is that they provide. Exercising true responsibility under such conditions is almost impossible. In addition, teacher voices and institutions responsible for amplifying them have been made suspect in this ordered culture of accountability. For example, just think to yourself on your own perceptions of teacher unions. Where do they come from? What has informed them? Does the narrative, teacher unions protect teachers from being held to account, sound familiar? Just as a footnote, I implore you to please not set foot in the classroom without joining a union. There are so many reasons, and it doesn't really matter which union you join. I'd be very happy to discuss this with you more, or go and speak to Professor Kapp or Dr. Angier on the Newly Qualified Teachers Project about how many experiences of newly qualified teachers we've seen ending up in labour conflicts with no protection at all. But back to the session. Perhaps the main point from Biesta about how we take responsibility for our responsibility is to notice that having doubt about the possibility for ethical rules and systems is the beginning of that responsibility, not its end. Hard as it may be, your uncertainty about the rules is actually a good thing. I'd like to encourage you to notice the compatibilities between this idea of responsibility and Christie's ethical imagination from section 3. Her criterion of intellectual rigor means questioning and probing, and not just accepting what the rules tell you. Her criterion of public engagement means resisting the reduction of relations to pure economic terms. And her criterion of an ethics of care is Bauman's moral proximity. The uncertainty encourages you to listen with openness. Responsibility, then, along with an ethical imagination, provide us with some useful tools for thinking about how to practice ethically in our work as teachers. In this session, we have discussed the idea that certain shifts in education systems and discourses have generated real problems for being an ethical professional educator. Client service provider types of relationships, market forces, and superficial choice have eroded meaningful democratic engagement between different players in public education. We've identified that there are distorting incentives and processes, which are often ends in and of themselves, rather than means to better education for learners and teachers. The idea of quality is so unspecified and overused that it has become almost meaningless. We've realized that to avoid being caricatured as encouraging irresponsibility, we need to say what it is we want in education relationships that accountability can't provide. That is, we must be specific about what responsibility means. We've used Bauman's work to give us one way of describing this difference between the moral moment or just following the rules or the mob. We've recognized that responsibility is very hard in a climate of accountability, but that there is still a glimmer of hope for regaining what has been lost. And finally, we've connected the concept of Christie's ethical imagination to the ideas from Biesta's paper. Sure, well done. You've made it through the hardest section of this course. In the next section, we'll look at the SACE Code of Conduct and what it means to think about that code of conduct using the ideas we've developed in these first 4 sections. Have a lovely weekend. I'll see you next time.